Yes, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name's Jordan. I'm the Sustainability Education Officer at North Sydney Council, and this is a very well attended registered webinar on composting. Composting is, we set as part of the Compost Revolution program, we sell a lot of compost bins, about 150 every year, as well as 150 worm palms. And so we've been doing that for about 5 years. If you are a North Sydney resident, you can get up to 50% off plus free delivery. Just letting you know that. But yeah, so before we begin, I'd just like to also acknowledge the Camaragal people, the traditional owners of the land in North Sydney, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And yeah, so welcome everyone. A couple of housekeeping things. We'll be Kate and I will be chatting throughout the webinar, but please feel free to send through your questions. We will try to answer them as we go along. But also, if we don't get to your questions, we've allocated plenty of time at the end there to have a Q&A. So yeah, we'll do our best, but shoot through any comments, questions as we go. I think it's a good way to share with other people as well about your experience. If you don't already, could you just please pop your, go on mute? I think everyone is, but yeah, just if you don't, can just go on mute, that'd be great. Okay. Thanks, Megan. Yep, right. Yeah, so without further ado, I'd just like to introduce Kate. So this is the first time working with Kate, but really excited because I first heard about her on her Instagram. If you haven't gone on and seen her Instagram yet, please do. I'll also share the link to her account in the follow-up. But she creates some really funny, interesting videos on composting, and she makes it fun. And so it gets you excited about composting, and I think that's what we're all here for, to find out how we can all, step it up. So yeah, please give a warm welcome to Kate. And Kate, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. It's exciting to be here. It's I must admit, it's a new world for me doing Zoom composting sessions, because when I am a sustainability educator, and when I do this pre-pandemic, everything is in person. But it's actually been interesting. I've started doing some more flexible compost coaching sessions with people online, and I think, in terms of all of you joining here today, I think it will be a really valuable session, because there's a lot I can communicate on these three really big topics, hopefully simply for you. So when you finish this session, you can feel confident to do some of these processes that I'm going to talk through in your own compost and really step up what you're doing. So thank you so much for giving me an hour of your time. So I am going to hop straight into it because there is a lot to cover. It's my understanding that most of you, if not all of you, currently have some form of waste management at home. So whether that is a compost bin or a worm farm, or maybe you have explored Bokashi or potentially even hot composting, but you're wanting to find further ways to reduce and manage your waste. And for me, the combination of Bokashi, hot compost and biochar becomes like a bit of the holy trinity of waste management, because they really, really work well together. And they all play their part to create really nutrient-rich garden gold. So compost that you can use on your pot plants or even in your garden, depending on where you live. So the way that we're going to try and run this session, which I'm testing Geordie out, it might push the technology to the limits. One of my platforms for educating people about compost is Instagram. So I use a lot of short format videos to teach some of these quite scientific forms of composting to total beginners. And I find that it's a really fun and engaging way to teach this information. So throughout this session, we're going to be trying to disperse some of those videos, show you them. Hopefully they work. But if they don't, I've got all the information that I can give you anyway. So I just want to start by saying, if you are composting at home, you're really enacting a form of climate activism. So it's a really, really fantastic thing that you're doing, not only for your own plants, but also for all of us working together to keep the planet cool. So first and foremost, I really think that all of you are waste warriors. So it's exciting. If you're wanting to step up your waste management, the first topic that I'm going to talk about is Bokashi composting, which is a form of anaerobic composting, which basically means oxygen-free. And the way that I like to describe it to people is it's a form of pre-composting. So what you produce within your Bokashi Bucket, which the Compost Revolution does sell, and you can get the discount through North Sydney Council or through your other councils across Australia. It's not a finished product that's produced within the Bokashi Bucket. You have to process it further. But the reason why I think Bokashi is such an exciting form of compost is because it allows you to really nail down your waste management, because you can safely compost meat, dairy, grains, all of those hard to compost scraps that you might think, oh, I'm not going to put this in my compost. It's going to attract rats. It could cause pathogens to occur. So it ends up going into landfill. But Bokashi kind of fills that gap. So the way that some of you might initially start liking to work with the Bokashi Bucket is using it primarily for those hard to compost food waste items like meat and dairy, and fermenting it. And then there's a number of different ways that you can then process it. So just to give you a little bit of a rundown, it's an oxygen-free fermentation process, and you do need what's called EM, which stands for effective microorganisms. You need that as the inoculant that actually then ferments your waste. So that can come in a number of different forms. I've reviewed quite a lot of different brands of them via my work, and in my experience, I don't know your opinion on this, Jordan, but the EM bran flakes. So it's the bran flakes are inoculated with beneficial bacteria, enzymes, and fungi. They are much more effective than the EM spray that you can get. I've found when I've used the spray from a number of different brands, I've never had a strong enough ferment. And if your food waste, as you can imagine, if you're fermenting meat and dairy and you get it wrong, you really, really know where that's wrong. So the product will start putrefying and you won't be making friends with your neighbours. It will be very stinky. Whereas if the process works, and I haven't failed a batch of Bokashi compost in a really long time now that I use the EM bran flakes, it's amazing how relatively odorless it is. So the smell of it smells like a funky, fermented, pickly smell. It doesn't smell like rotting meat at all. It's wrong if it smells like that. So I think maybe the first video that we'll try, so fingers crossed that this will work, is setting up a Bokashi bin. So you'll see just a short form video how I do that.
Okay, bear with me, folks. Let's give it a shot. DIY Bokashi bin?
Maybe we'll go setting up a Bokashi bin. So second from the bottom, Jordan.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Here's how I set up a new Bokashi bin. Add a small handful of the EM brands.
I can hear it, but I can't see it.
Then add your food scraps. Add another small handful on top. And here's the secret weapon. Use this to squish all of your food. Close the lid tightly and you're done.
I'm not sure. Maybe we can get some feedback from the audience. I heard it. I'm not sure if some of the faces that I can see. Did anyone see it or no? Okay.
Just heard it.
Just heard it.
You couldn't see it.
No, I could hear it, but I couldn't see it. If these don't work, if any of you, I must admit, I'm a new Instagram user. When I'm not during my compost education, I'm a high school educator, so I was really anti-social media. But if anyone is wanting to see any of theirs, I've got some long form videos as well. You can always head over there if it doesn't work.
Let me give this one more shot. Sorry about this, folks. I'm not sure if anyone's got any tips about maybe what I'm doing wrong. I should be pretty good at this. I've been running webinars for the last 18 months now, but I'll give it one more shot. Here we go. So you can't see anything that I'm sharing at the moment?
All I'm seeing, Jordan, is your actual, your box with all of the lineup of the videos, not the video itself didn't pop up. So that's all I could see when I heard the audio. I might just keep on talking while Jordan.
Sure.
So what the video that may play is showing how to set up a Bokashi bucket. So you do need to get two bits of equipment if you're wanting to start fermenting your food waste. The first is the bucket itself, and the second is that EM inoculant. The way you set up the bucket, I've got one here in person because that's always a bit more fail-safe than looking at videos online. You can buy a commercial bucket or you can make one yourself. And these commercial buckets, I'll show you first, come with, so this particular brand is Bokashi One. I'm not sure if the Compost Revolution sells them, but to be honest, they're all pretty similar. They will come with a grate, which sits down on top of the area where all of the compost Bokashi juice will drain. So that sits on top. And then you get what I describe as a toddler size handful of the Bokashi powder, and you sprinkle that down the bottom. And then you start layering in your food scraps. And because this is an anaerobic, so an oxygen-free form of fermentation, you need to fill your compost kitchen caddy. So that's your little bucket that sits on your kitchen bench first before you pour it into here. Because what you're not wanting to do, you don't want to be using these Bokashi buckets. You don't want to be opening them every day. So you don't want to open them and just chuck one banana skin in there. You really do need to be filling up your bucket that sits on your bench with all of your scraps. And then once that's full, which may take you a couple of days, then you put it into this Bokashi bucket. So you've put a layer of the EM bran in, a bucket of your food, and then the next process, which is really crucial so that your Bokashi compost doesn't start stinking, you need to get yourself a potato masher, or sometimes I even just use my compost caddy itself, so the bucket, and you need to squish down your waste. So you're wanting to make sure there's no pockets of air that are present within your food waste, because otherwise it will start putrefying and smelling. So you squish down your bucket of food scraps, and then you do another handful of the EM bacteria on top. Then what I like to do, because as you can imagine, if you just put in one bucket of your food waste into here, you're going to have a lot of airspace that's sitting on top of the food scraps, and that's not ideal for this form of composting. So what I recommend is you use carbon, and I'm going to be talking a lot about carbon tonight. So that could be a piece of cardboard, or it could be a piece of paper towel, some old newspaper. So you put a layer of carbon on top. And then when you go to fill it again, you can actually leave that carbon in there. So the video that may work, how are we going, Jordan?
And yeah, I'll give it one more shot. So I'm not.
No, that's all right. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. I don't know what is going on?
Look, if it pops up, it pops up, but otherwise I'll just keep on
okay,
talking.
no worries.
Time's precious. So I actually like to put some carbon into this bin. So generally, when I'm filling up my compost caddy that sits on my bench, I'm filling it with all of my food waste, but also things like tissues, paper towel, toilet paper rolls. There's so much human-made carbon that we produce. And I put that into my Bokashi bucket as well. It's not essential. You can just fill it with food waste. So it's not like aerobic composting, where you need that CN balance, so the balance of carbon to nitrogen, you can just fill a Bokashi compost with food and it will work. But the reason why I like to add carbon into it, it helps create structure within the bin. So I've got 3 young kids and we produce a lot of food waste, unfortunately. I'm always trying to finish their scraps myself. But, we end up with food that is, kind of sloppy and moist, so something like, if you can imagine, leftover cereal or a little bit of yogurt, stuff like that, which you wouldn't normally put into the compost, can go into your Bokashi bucket, even though it is quite wet, when you add carbon, because it creates that structure within the bin. And the really fantastic thing about the EM bacteria is it will actually inoculate that carbon too, which means when you go to the next process in Bokashi compost, which is either adding your fermented food waste into your compost bin or adding it into a soil factory, which I'll discuss how you do that. So that's really for apartment dwellers, or digging a hole and burying it. All of that carbon that you've been adding in has been totally inoculated with the beneficial bacteria and will help break down your waste and also help heat it up. So when I talk about hot compost, we'll be talking about how the microbes work to heat up your compost.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions. Just Henry asks about, do you need to shred the paper before you put it in the bin?
I don't. We produce a lot of food waste, and so we've moved recently, as lots of people have during COVID. We lived in Birchgrove in Sydney, and now we live in Bega. And it's been interesting moving from a place where I would get food waste from 11 households in Sydney via the Share Waste app. So if any of you are looking for more food waste, which I know as composters we always are, the more food waste, the better. I was composting a lot of food waste in Sydney, and now here in Bega, because we have FOGO, so that's the ability to put your food scraps into your green waste bin, I'm not able to get nearly as much from our neighbours, which is, it's all been composted, but I personally want as much as I can. The carbon that we have in our household, because I have 3 kids, we have worm farms, Hot Compost, Bokashi, we have lots of different systems going, me being a compost educator. I like to simplify processes, and I find that adding carbon in its intact form, so let's say you've got a paper bag from the butcher, I simply will scrunch it up so that or scrunch it, or even add it in flat, and add that as is into the Bokashi compost, because it's going to be fermented and then it will be composted. And it breaks down amazingly. Even corrugated cardboard, which I know lots of us are producing with all of the online shopping that we're doing during these lockdowns, I quite like using that as the piece of carbon that I put on top of my food waste, and I just put it in whole and I leave it, and then I put my next lot of food waste on top of that. So even chunky bits of carbon like that break down really well.
Yeah, great. And what about meat? That includes the bones as well, doesn't it?
Yes. So I've got here some bones that have been run through our Bokashi compost, and then they have been run through our hot compost. And what I'm left with is a completely odorless, it's totally, there's nothing smelly, nothing yucky about them. I'm sure a dog would like to chew on them, but they're sort of denuded. So the Bokashi fermentation process has allowed all of that meat to break down really safely. But what you do end up with are these remnants of bones. And what I used to do was just bury them in the garden, and then they will eventually break down, but they take a really long time. So that's why I have actually started turning them into biochar. So with meat scraps that I'm putting into my Bokashi bin, so this one looks like it came off a lamb shoulder, I think. So we've eaten as much of the meat as we can, and then that actually directly goes into the Bokashi bucket and ferments, and then I hot compost it. So adding in things like bones are perfect into a Bokashi system. Should I talk about biochar now? I feel like there's still a bit more that I should talk about.
Sure. No, I think that's a good idea. Yep.
Okay. Just keeping it up fun.
Do you want me to start one of the?
Yeah. Look, let's try it one more time. Otherwise, we'll move on. So if you could show setting up a Bokashi bucket, Jordan, that would be great. we did try this before all of you jumped on here, and it did work. So it's one of those things, isn't it? Technology.
So, biochar. Here we go.
Oh, so setting up your Bokashi would be great.
Is that coming up? Anyone? No?
Not for me, no.
Oh wow, okay.
Zoom is notoriously like this. Yes, I agree. So anyway, we'll move on. That's fine. So once you have set it up, a really important thing is, so there's a couple of factors that you need to bear in mind. You're filling it with your kitchen caddy of waste. You're adding in that toddler-sized handful of the EM bran flakes on top of each bucket. You're squishing it down so that there's no oxygen, and you're putting that piece of carbon on top. You need to make sure that you fill your bin. So I find with people that I've worked with, they say, oh, my Bokashi absolutely stunk. And what has happened is they've left it to ferment, and they actually half filled it, or they haven't squished it down. So oxygen has been present in the food waste, and it's ended up putrefying, not fermenting. So use your nose, and if your Bokashi bucket is smelling, it's usually because oxygen's come in. Sometimes I find as well with the lids, you have to make sure you're pushing the lid down firmly so that no oxygen can come into here. So once your Bokashi bucket is full, you want to be squishing in as much as you possibly can so that it's not too much airspace that sits on top of your food waste. You then need to leave it to ferment. So this process, you need to have a minimum of 2 weeks. Ideally, you have a month where it ferments. You don't open the lid, so it can be tempting, but you just let the EM beneficial microbes do their thing. When you do open up the lid, there's a video that I would have shown you, but I'll describe to you what you should see. So you should see on top of your food waste beneficial mold that has developed. So you know that it's correct because it will be white. It will actually be, it's quite amazing looking mold. It's really fluffy. It can be in small patches, or you can get a really quite big fluffy head of it on top of your food waste. This mold, as you pour your food waste into your compost bin, won't be throughout the whole bucket. It really just sits on the surface layer, but that's what you're wanting to see. In some instances, especially in winter, because the EM microbes work best at an ambient temperature of about 20 degrees, you may find that the Bokashi compost hasn't developed that. But if you open up the lid and it doesn't stink, and it kind of looks just the same, but it smells, has a pickly smell rather than a putrefying smell, but there's no mold, that still means it's worked. So don't feel like if you haven't seen the mold, it hasn't worked. If you've opened it up after 2 weeks and there's no mold, I do recommend leaving it for a further 2 weeks. But after a month, if there still isn't that beneficial mold that has developed, then it is time to process it anyway, because you can leave your food waste too long in this bin and then it will start breaking down too much and putrefying. So it's sort of that balance. So 2 weeks to a month is ideal for the fermentation. Then you need to compost it. So when you open this up, you're not going to see finished compost. The food is actually going to look relatively similar to the food waste that you added in, but it has really dramatically changed at a molecular level. So when you then add it into your compost bin, even though you might see you've squeezed a lemon and all of the lemon is still pretty much intact after the two weeks to 1 month fermentation, when you add it to your compost, so when it changes from an anaerobic to an aerobic compost, it will break down incredibly fast because it has fermented. So let me just quickly talk about the ways that you can process Bokashi. I love hot composting it because the Bokashi compost itself is actually a compost activator. So hot compost needs the CN ratio, but you also need lots of juicy bacterial ingredients to really get your hot compost firing, and Bokashi compost provides that. So I add it into my compost system and it dramatically helps to heat my waste. If you live in an apartment and you're wanting to Bokashi compost, because as you can imagine, these bins themselves, I'll show you my homemade one. So these buckets you can keep indoors. So if you live in an apartment and you don't have a garden, you can still use this form of composting. This homemade one we got these buckets from one of our local cafes for free, and all I've done is drilled lots of holes in the bottom. That sits on top of another bucket. So the same processes are involved. However, I'm not sure if you noticed on the commercial one, there's a tap, whereas these homemade ones don't have the capacity to, well, you actually could put a tap on here, but I haven't, and they still work just as well. So to drain the Bokashi juice, you simply lift up this top bucket, add water into here, and then you can use it on your plants. So that's another really beneficial thing about Bokashi compost. You have the fermented waste, but you also have the Bokashi lactate, which is full of the bacteria and is like supercharged fertilizer for your garden, but it is incredibly strong. So you need to dilute it. So it's generally, you use about 1 tablespoon of the Bokashi liquid to 10 litres of water. So with this style, I just leave the juice in here and fill the whole bucket up with water. Whereas with these ones, they have a tap, so you can drain it out. And you should be draining any of the liquid that is coming out of the Bokashi bucket really regularly throughout the fermentation process, and also while you're filling it, because that helps prevent odors. And it's also a really beneficial thing to use. You can use it on your garden, or you can even pour it directly down your drain, which may feel like you're wasting it, but you're actually not. The EM bacteria helps to eat through any buildup of hair or fat that is in your drains. So it's a natural way of cleaning your drains, not using, what is it, Drano or some of those like ridiculously toxic chemicals. So, work with nature, not against it.
Okay. So Megan actually had a good idea about potentially sharing your the videos on Instagram. So I've lined up just the Bokashi one. So I thought we'd give that a go. One final shot, folks. Here we go. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah, we can see that.
All right, I'll just play that.
Well done, Jordan.
Oh, well. Thanks, Megan, for the workaround.
I set up a new Bokashi bin. Add a small handful of the EM brands to the bottom of your bin. Then add your food scraps. Add another small handful on top. And here's the secret weapon. Use this to squish all of your food. Close the lid tightly and you're done. Here's how I set up a new Bokashi.
And now you can watch it 5 times over. So maybe if we feel like we could, if you're happy, I might get you to line up showing the fermented Bokashi, if you can find that, because that's a useful thing to eyeball. Because one thing that I'll mention about what you're wanting to see in a Bokashi as opposed to what you're not wanting. So troubleshooting with the Bokashi, you use your nose knows if it stinks, something's gone wrong. But also if you find that mold of any other color, white is beneficial, blue, black, green, sometimes pink mold that has developed means pathogenic mold has started developing. And if that has happened, which, when you're starting this process, I've been Bokashi composting for over 10 years. And when I started, I absolutely did get some buckets that failed. You can still process it at home, but what I wouldn't recommend adding it to your compost bin. If you have access to a garden, dig a hole, bury it directly, and then the soil food web will break it down. But yeah, you're just wanting to see white mold. So you know that something's gone wrong if you've seen mold of any other color. I'll hop back over just talking about processing your Bokashi. So you can add it to your compost bin. A lot of you probably are composting at home using cold compost. So that is compost that you're building gradually. You're adding in your food waste, you're adding in your brown carbon material, but it's not heating up. You can add Bokashi compost to that safely, because even with meat, which sort of feels a bit revolutionary and a bit scary the first time you do it, but the reason why it's safe is during the fermentation of your scraps, especially things like meat, the enzymes are producing acids, and the acids help to prevent pathogens from actually occurring. So that's one of the mechanisms that happens within Bokashi to help keep your products safe. But the other is also the fact that the EM bacteria, so there's a couple of strains, there's enzymes, there's bacteria, and there's also fungi within the bran. They outcompete pathogens. So they are designed to be working in that anaerobic environment, whereas things like Salmonella and E. coli aren't. And those the beneficial bacteria outcompete the nasty ones. So you can feel pretty confident adding it into your cold compost. And you may well find, because Bokashi is a really great activator, that it will actually help to heat your cold compost bins up. So you can add it to your cold compost, you can batch, you can save a few batches. So you're probably thinking during that fermentation period, you will have a lag in which you are not filling up a bucket. So you've got a bucket that's fermenting. That's why it is really good if you can make your own, which maybe Jordan, sorry, I asked you to show the fermented one, but I might, if you can.
Sorry, I can't find that one.
Okay, don't worry. I've got so many videos. If anyone,
yeah.
We can work out a Dropbox or something, some way to share all of them with you
Yeah.
guys. Making your own, if you can make or buy 2 Bokashi buckets. That means while one is fermenting, you can be filling your other one. And if you're wanting to use it for your hot compost, it's good to fill a couple of them and then use them in one go, because with hot compost, unlike cold composting, you need to build the pile at once. I'll just briefly mention, because I know that there's so much to talk about.
Okay, did you want to have a look at how to make the DIY bin? Or
did you find? Yeah, if you can find that, that'd be brilliant. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Jordan.
Yeah.
Yes.
Repurpose
We can hear it, but we can't see it.
You need to choose a bucket.
Oh wait.
So I'll just keep on talking because time is precious. So people that live in apartments can Bokashi compost themselves as well. Oh, there it is.
Okay.
With a firm fitting lid and one with a wide rim on top. You're going to need to get your hands on a drill with an 8mm drill bit. This is the ideal size because it's big enough to have holes that will allow all the Bokashi juice to drain through, but it's not so big that food scraps will fall through. Turn one of the buckets upside down and start drilling a hole through the plastic. Don't apply too much pressure. Let the drill do the work for you. Once you've drilled lots of holes in the bottom, the way you use this bin is you simply place this bucket on top of the other one. The bottom bucket will collect all the Bokashi juice, and the top bucket you'll fill with your food waste and your EM brand. This design is so simple, you don't even need a tap on the bottom bucket. The way to empty the Bokashi juice is you simply remove the top bucket, and then you pour this Bokashi juice into a watering can. Remember to dilute it because it's quite strong. And that's how to make your
Thanks, Jordan.
I like that jumper. I'm surprised you haven't got any comments about that. Where'd you get that one? That's a beauty.
That's all of my clothes come from, most of them from Sydney op shops, but now Bega Salvos, it has got some excellent wool vintage secondhand jumpers that I love. So having a few Bokashi bins is really helpful, and making your own. So those buckets that you saw in that video, I got for free from our local cafe. The buckets were, local cafes often have these. So they're whole egg mayonnaise buckets. And you can use buckets of any volume. 20 litres is good, but it's not dependent on the volume for fermentation. So they can be bigger, they can be smaller, depending on what you get. But you do need one with a firm fitting lid. If you want to process Bokashi compost in an apartment, then you can make what's called a soil factory, which if you can find the video for that would be really useful, but otherwise I'll just describe it. So basically you're changing your fermented food waste, which is anaerobic, to aerobic compost within your compost bin or a soil factory. And to make that, all you need is a large tub. It can be a garden pot, or it could even be a plastic container. So it doesn't have to have drainage holes, but if it's a garden pot, it can. I put down a layer of, in a garden pot, because there's holes, I put down a layer of wood chips so that they sit above the drainage holes. But if you're making it in a plastic container that doesn't have holes, you don't need to do that step. You need, the essential thing with a soil factory is it has to be made with soil. So healthy soil, so this is not, I'm not talking about bag soil, I'm talking about soil that literally has come out of the earth, is full of beneficial bacteria. And that gets to work breaking down your waste. So you put down a layer of soil first, and then you pour in your fermented food waste on top of that. And then it's a good idea if you mix those two together and then put some more soil on top of that. You can then create layers of the Bokashi and the soil within your soil factory. And all of those microbes, and if you happen to scoop up any worms in your garden as well, all of those get to work breaking down your waste. And that's why it's a really useful system for apartment dwellers, because you can make it in a large pot, which you could keep on your balcony if you had one, or if you don't, you could have it in a common area, you know, down in a garage or next to the recycling bins, especially if you have a lid. So you don't want to get your contents overly wet. So if it's outdoors, it does need to have some sort of cover to protect it. It's a good idea as well, because we're changing the conditions from oxygen-free to an oxygen-rich environment. You do want to gently aerate it as well, and that helps break it down. Now, I might take, if there's any questions about Bokashi, you could go into that, but I feel like we should maybe jump into, are you wanting to find the soil factory? Do you want to? Oh, that's right. I think maybe we'll jump into talking about biochar now. So the reason why I love biochar is there was a bit of a missing link for me. So we are meat eaters in our household, so we do end up with remnants that don't break down. So these bones, as I said, have been Bokashi composted and hot composted, but I still have these remnants. So biochar effectively is charcoal, but it has slightly different properties to charcoal, because the pore space within it is more of an open structure, and one of the tests to see if it is actually biochar, not just regular charcoal, if you grab a handful of it and jiggle it around, it should sound like glass. So it's a pretty miraculous thing to make. Effectively, you're making it in a condition which is high heat. So this is not composting that you could do in an apartment. So you need to actually be burning it, and it needs to have low oxygen. So I make my biochar in one of these biochar burners, which if you have a pizza oven that's wood fired, or if you have a combustion stove that's wood fired, or even if you have a fire pit, you can add these little burners into it. If you have the luxury of having a big garden, you can actually make biochar by digging a 1 meter pit that has to be quite big, the volume, and building it in that. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the process of actually building those fire pits, because my vision for this is that you live somewhere a bit more inner city. So I'm thinking about all of you North Sydney Council residents, and maybe you do have access to a fire pit, or maybe it's not you that has it, but a friend. So these bones don't smell at all. I don't make biochar all the time. I make it in batches. So I save up all of my Bokashi and hot compost bones, and I make them in one batch. And the reason why biochar is amazing to then add into your hot compost bin is it actually helps the hot composting microbes, so the thermophilic microbes, to stay hotter for longer. And biochar is something that I really hope all of us will hear more about, because it's one of the solutions for helping keep carbon in our soil. So it sequesters carbon from the atmosphere and draws it back down into the soil, which is one of the major things that we can all be doing to help prevent climate change. Help.
I've actually got the video lined up. Should we play the, yeah.
Well done. Let's show that.
Right. Here we go.
Want to know how to turn old bones into beneficial biochar? The process is magical. Look at that. The bones go in our biochar burner on our fire for 1 to 2 hours. These bones have had a real blow up from something that was once waste to now something that's going to be incredible in your soil. Want to know how to turn.
So the reason why biochar is so amazing in your soil is the pore spaces that are created within the charcoal, and the fact that it's a really stable form of carbon. So beneficial microbes and fungi actually start living in all of the little holes that are all of the little holes that are created within the biochar. And then when you add that into your compost and then eventually your soil, it actually stays as a nutrient-packed little apartment block of bacteria that feeds your soil for years and years to come. So it's not something that breaks down, but that we're wanting it to actually stay as that stable form of carbon. So to make it into this really magical ingredient, there's a couple of steps that you need to do. You need to charge it. So they call it biocharging, but basically all that is, so you can see these bones are not biochar yet, but if they were, I would grind them up, and that's a really easy process. They become really brittle. So you can grind them up into quite a fine powder, and which I do myself, just with an old tin in a big timber bowl that we have. So they're really fragile and brittle, and so it's easy to do. And then you need to add that into a bacteria-rich environment. So you can use your Bokashi juice, so they're working hand in hand, or if you're wanting to experiment with compost tea, so that's aerating using a Hessian sack that you fill up with your healthy finished compost, and you aerate it with ideally tank water so the chlorine's not killing it, for a couple of days so that it actually turns into a compost tea. You put all of your biochar into that for at least 24 hours to fill up the pores, because when you first make biochar, it's hydrophobic, which means it repels water, and we need to be filling up all of those little cavities with beneficial bacteria. If you're adventurous, you can have a further look at this. There's lots of YouTube videos about biochar. People become pretty addicted to it because it has such huge benefits to your soil. You can actually charge it with urine as well. So anyone that's game. But effectively, you're charging it with bacteria that's beneficial and a really nitrogen-rich input. So that's why people do use urine. Once that's happened, then you add it into your compost. So this is leading us into talking about hot compost. So biochar, when you add it into your compost, helps the microbes actually break down your waste, because it helps the thermophilic microbes stay hotter for longer. If you're wanting to experiment with this, you should be adding about anywhere between 5 to 20% of biochar into your compost. And that's why hot compost works really well with these processes, because hot composting, unlike potentially what you guys might be doing at home, you make in one big batch. So you're not adding in a bucket of food waste and then brown leaves every week or so. You're accumulating all of your green and brown inputs, and then making them together in like one big compost cake. So that's why at our house, we always make hot compost. So I save up, we have quite a lot of Bokashi bins because I've made a lot of my own. I save at least 4, and then I start gathering my brown. So I'm jumping straight into hot compost now because the time is of the essence. The C/N ratio is really, really crucial. So C is for carbon, N is for nitrogen. So let me just quickly describe that for anyone that is unaware of this. So this is also important for cold composting too. You need to have a lot more carbon, so the brown stuff, to the green, juicy, nitrogen-rich stuff. So I say brown is best, then chuck in the rest. You're wanting to have at least double the volume of carbon to greens. So carbon is the dry, dead stuff. So brown leaves, wood chips, lucerne, all different natural carbon, but also man-made carbon. So things like newspaper, pizza boxes, paper towels, tissues, all of those sources actually provide energy for the microbes. And then you've got your nitrogen. So that is your food waste, your fresh garden waste, so whether that's prunings or weeds. So you're needing to have double the brown to the green, and you're accumulating that all. So when we hot compost at home, I, over several weeks, I've raked up all of the street leaves. I've got my Bokashi buckets. I've done a lot of gardening. I've got a bucket full of weeds. I might have gone to the beach and got some seaweed. We've gone to the local coffee shop and got coffee grounds, and they then get layered up. as a really active compost cake. So you're adding in layer by layer. It is a good idea if you have got a compost aerator, so that's like a corkscrew turner or a garden fork, to be stirring it a bit as you go, because it's an aerobic process. We're wanting air in there as well. So there's 4 components of hot compost. There's greens, browns, oxygen, and water. So as you're building those green and brown layers, you're mixing them. And you also need to wet them down. So Bokashi compost, you'll find, is a moist input, but some of your other greens and browns are going to be quite dry, and you need a hydration of about 50 to 60%. So the way you can tell that, what does that mean? The way you can tell you've got the correct hydration is if you grab a handful of compost and you give it a squeeze, it should feel like a wrung out sponge. So no more than a couple of drops of moisture should be able to be squeezed out. If you can grab a handful and it's just drenched with water, that will be too wet, and then you'll create anaerobic conditions within your compost bin, which means it will stink and it will take a long time to break down. So there's a balance, and it is a bit of an art, but I find if you're creating your hot compost as an open pile or within a compost bin that's open to the ground, then if there is too much water, that's not the biggest deal, because it can just drain out.
Okay, we've got the hot compost video and carbon to nitrogen. Should we play both of those?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Cool. I'll play
27 photos to this sound and let it sink.
Maybe even play it twice, Jordan. It might fix it so quick.
7 photos to this sound and let it sink. At 20.
So I do use a lot of sort of eye-catching things in here.
Banana. Respect. Banana.
Okay, that one you don't need to keep on playing. So what you may have seen with those layers, that I know, look, it's Instagram, everything moves quickly. You have to capture people's attention within 3 seconds, but let me explain it to you in a bit more detail. So you can see I have layered up green and brown and green and brown, and I've added some compost activators. So Bokashi Compost is a compost activator, but to really get things hot and steamy, I also add in small. So you need to be careful, because you can end up changing the pH of your compost. So you're wanting your compost to be neutral to slightly acidic. If you go too hard on things like manures or especially chicken manure, you can end up creating alkaline compost, which lots of plants don't like. So the compost activators that I added in were small handfuls of blood and bone and pelletized chicken manure, and also other manures. So we, living in the country now, we've got access to sheep and cow manure, which is really exciting for me being a city girl, having all of this on tap. You don't have to add those. It can literally be your Bokashi food waste and your carbon. But hot compost is the best when it's really diverse. So you can think about feeding your soil all of these different inputs, and then you end up with this nutrient-packed product for your plants, because each different input has different minerals in it, and also the compost microbes themselves need those different nutrients to actually multiply and break down your waste. So talking about the compost microbes, it's not worms in hot compost that are breaking down the waste, it's microbes. So there's phases of your hot compost. So you've seen how I built that bin with layers, and then I aerate it, and as I'm filling it, I'm adding water so everything's nice and moist, and then you put the lid on, and within 24 to 36 hours you should see really active heat generation. If you haven't seen that happening, something's off. Often it's to do with the volume. So when you read about hot compost online, people say you need 1 cubic meter of volume, so that's about 1,000 litres. But in my experience, if you use Bokashi, You can do it in a much smaller volume. So 400 litres is what we use. We use the tumbleweed Getty bins, and also we've got an Aerating composter, both of which are 400 litres. So 400 litres really is the minimum, but it's a really good size. So my hot compost gets hot within the 24 to 36 hours, stays really hot for at least 2 weeks, sometimes longer. And then it starts cooling off. And I'll talk about compost curing. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. So talking about compost microbes, once you've set up your bin, the first lot of microbes that will start coming into your compost when it's between 20 and 40 degrees are what's called mesophilic microbes. They're not the heavy lifters, but they play a really important role. So they're going to initially break down your waste. As your waste continues to start heating up and reaching between 40 to 60 degrees, then thermophilic microbes come to play, and they're really the ball busters of the hot compost scene. They are super efficient at breaking down your food waste, especially when it's been Bokashi composted, because at a molecular level, that food waste is already partially broken down. If you're composting things like meat, it is really important if you haven't pre-Bokashi done, so if you're adding in meat scraps without Bokashi composting them, that your compost reaches the critical temperature of 60 degrees, because that at 60 degrees, that's when any pathogens are absolutely killed. Also, for those of you that are wanting to hot compost weeds, so weeds are nitrogen fixers. So soil that's been disrupted, weeds will come in. They may be annoying to us, but they're actually serving quite an important purpose for the soil. So it's a really good idea composting weeds, because then you're returning that nitrogen back into your soil. But if you cold compost weeds, the weed seeds are going to germinate in your garden again. Whereas if you hot compost them, the heat stops germination from occurring. So it means that the seeds are no longer viable. But to achieve that, so you can be really confident that the weeds are not going to germinate, you need your temperature to hit 60 degrees and stay that temperature for 7 consecutive days as a minimum, which following that video showing the layers, setting it all your bin up all in one go, really helps to create the critical volume that allows the microbes to work and stay consistently hot.
Good question from Lucinda, who asks, can compost get too hot?
Yes, it can. So during that, when your compost is heating up, you lift up the bin and you'll get a big billow of steam. And the way, interestingly, there's aerating your compost plays 2 roles. So aerating your compost with a compost turner. So if you're making it in a bin, a corkscrew compost turner will become your best friend, because you can twist it all the way down through the organic matter and you pull it back up, and that allows oxygen to enter your pile. If your compost gets too hot, so I had a batch where I think I added in quite a lot of Bokashi, which I usually do, but then I also added in quite a lot of cow manure, and there was just a lot cooking, and it kept on, so it got to 60 degrees happily within the 24 hours. And then I have a compost thermometer, which is a useful thing to have as well, because that's giving you real-time feedback about what temperature your compost is at. I could see that it was getting to 65 the next day, and then it was starting to get to 70. And the problem with compost getting that temperature is the thermophilic microbes start dying. So they're only active at about 55 to 65 degrees. Above that, they will start dying off. And other compost invertebrates that travel around the edge of the compost, so things like worms and beetles, will die off as well, because it's just too hot. So the way to cool your compost, interestingly, is aerating it as well. So you end up, as you're turning your compost with the corkscrew turner, you're releasing a lot of the excess heat back into the environment. So regularly doing that, monitoring your compost as it's active, is really important, because you'll find with commercial compost, they often cook their compost at higher temperatures because it gets processed really quickly, but you end up losing nutrients. So yes, you'll make stuff that looks like soil and it looks like black finished compost, but there's actually not much left in there. So you are wanting to keep it at about 60 degrees, which isn't hard. Active aeration does disperse the heat. Any other questions, or can I talk about?
Yeah, go for it. So yeah, keep going, I think.
Yeah. So in terms of that active period, it will last generally with a 400 litre bin, the heat ends up lasting for about the really active thermophilic heat will last for about 2 weeks. Then you'll see that even as you're turning it, because interestingly, turning your compost as it starts to cool can reignite and reheat your pile, because what you're doing is you're pulling some of the organic matter that may be on the outside of the bin that hasn't broken down back into the middle, and then the microbes can start breaking that down, and that heats up the pile again. But if you've done that quite a few times and nothing's really happening, it's now starting to drop down, so you're getting to 40 degrees and then back down to the ambient temperature of what the environment is outside. That's telling you that you've gone out of that active phase and you're now in the mesophilic slower phase of compost, which is really important. So people often get really excited, which I totally get, it is exciting when you're in that active steamy phase, but the later phases of decomposition are really important too for creating nutrient rich compost. So as you've rode that wave of high heat, as it starts getting down to the ambient temperature, you need to continue to leave it. So you might look at your compost and think, oh, well, it looks ready, but actually all of those processes that are happening at those cooler temperatures are really important. So they will continue breaking down things like cellulose. So if you've used wood chips, which I personally like using a combination of wood chips and different forms of carbon, you'll see that wood chips are still intact after the thermophilic phase. But if you leave them during the mesophilic phase and then further into curing, they will continue to break down. And you'll also see as your compost reaches the ambient outdoor temperature, fungi and worms will start returning back into the pile, because when it's really hot, worms are clever, they get the hell out of there. But as the temperature cools, then all of those composting invertebrates will come back in, and fungi will too. So if you start seeing mushrooms forming within your hot compost as it has cooled down and it's in its curing phase, you've really hit the gold mine. So a fungi-rich compost is just the most beneficial thing to apply to your soil. It's something that's lacking in a lot of overworked soil. So if you see fungi developing, leave them. Don't continue to create compost, because you'll break up all of those fungi membranes. You leave it to break down, and it will also continue breaking down the cellulose in the wood and in the more fibrous carbon ingredients. So in terms of how long to cure your compost, how long is a piece of string? The longer, the better. So if you can have a couple of, if you have the luxury of space and you have a couple of active compost piles going, then you can leave them really for, as long as you can until you're ready to use it on your soil. I could talk so much more, but should I?
Great. Thanks, Kate. I've lined up a few videos, so I thought maybe cool. We'll just have a look at those. We've got activation, we've got the aeration, and I know you haven't quite touched on it, but how to harvest compost. And then
look, maybe we should. Can we show? If you've got the curing compost video, that would be great to show at this point. But if not, harvesting, because that's the next thing that we can talk about.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, play what you want. That's fine. Thanks.
Okay. I think.
This compost may appear ready. It looks like soil with no visible food waste, but let's take a closer look. Fungi are breaking down the lignin in the remaining wood, and mesophilic bacteria are still active, making sure your compost is suitable for your plants. And that's why it's really important to cure your compost. This compost may...
I should explain. Before you play another one, I do use a lot of humor in my videos to encourage people to start composting, so just be warned. This one's more educational. Here you go.
Wearing gloves, unfold the rodent-proof mesh from the edges and lift your bin off. Now go digging for garden gold, but make sure you leave behind the wood chip base and raw compost to reseed your next bin. Pop your compost bin back on top and reinstall the rodent mesh. And that's how to harvest your finished compost.
So you can see here in this video, something that I haven't mentioned, which actually it's a great reminder saying that I apply rodent and snake-proof mesh to the bottom of all of my bins. And the reason why I do that is because I ferment in my Bokashi buckets meat scraps and also dairy and grains. They're really attracting scraps to rodents, so to rats and mice. And if you're using an open to the ground bin, which for hot compost is ideal because then you're getting all of the soil bacteria directly in contact with your organic matter, it's really important to do two things, one of two things to make sure rats don't come into your compost. Either apply the rodent proof mesh, which is, you can buy it in a big sheet I got mine from Mitre 10. It's quite flexible, but it's really tough. So you cut out a square, put it on top, your bin on top, cut out a rough circle, and then fold up all of the edges. And you use that mesh over and over again. So you apply that as a barrier to stop rats coming in. Or if you don't want to buy a product, then just simply digging a hole in your soil and burying your compost bin about 10 centimeters down into the soil will help prevent rodents coming in. So harvesting your compost, what you might have seen in that video as well, I like to leave a little bit of the finished compost down the bottom. And when I build my hot compost, I always have wood chips below that. So I leave the wood chips and I leave a small amount of finished compost to what's called reseed your bin. So a handful of finished compost is full of all of those microorganisms that we've been talking about. And that, if you leave it and then build your next hot compost or cold compost on top of that, actually will be transferred into the next organic matter, which gives you a head start. What else to talk about? Do we have time, Jordan? Or
We sort of run out of time now. But yeah, if there's, I suppose what we might do, just because there was a few technical difficulties, is
yes.
we've had some really good questions, and I think what we'll do is I might send out those questions with some answers in the evaluation or in the follow-up email.
Yes.
So then everyone can sort of find out, so get answers to some of the questions that in the chat, just because we've run out of time for the questions.
Yes.
Yeah. But I think, is there anything else you want to touch on in terms of the hot compost?
So look, it can feel intimidating if you haven't given it a go, but effectively, it's similar to the cold composting that you may be doing, but you're just doing it in one big batch. So if you can get organized with Bokashi compost being a real string to your bow, because that allows you to keep all of your food waste in an active form. So getting your green and brown inputs organized, I really recommend giving it a go, because it does create really nutrient dense compost, and it does it in a much shorter time. So cold compost is a beautiful process, but it can take up to a year to be finished. And if you're here, you're really wanting to step up your compost game, I really recommend it. And look, and I just want to say as well, all of you who are here, I really appreciate your time, because, you know, it's been an interesting confluence of COVID making us more interested in our own patches, you know, the huge emphasis and awareness about climate change and what we can do as individuals, but it's, you know, it's not an individual issue, but that doesn't mean that we can't actually really enact change. So dealing with your food waste responsibly not only means you'll have a really lush and beautiful garden, but it is a really massive climate positive thing that you can do. And it's an exciting thing. You know, I'm in love with the process of composting because it is fun, and, you know, you're seeing science come to life before your eyes, and you see that amazing closed loop economy that you're creating by feeding your food waste back into your soil.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when, you know, nearly half of our red bin waste is food waste. I mean, that's one of the biggest ways you can make a real difference, for sure.
Yeah, well, that's right. So just that stat, that what that means in real terms is, if you're looking at the emitters of greenhouse gases, so there's looking at, if we imagine food waste as a country, you probably know this statistic, but every time I say it, it blows my mind. So if we're looking at food waste as a country, we've got America, China, and then food waste. So that, in terms of climate change emitters, that's the third biggest in the list. So, you know, what we do at home with our waste truly does matter. And getting that message out, you know, if you've got neighbours who don't have the capacity to compost, I love being a Share Waste. I don't know if you know about the Share Waste app. It's a free app. It connects you with your neighbourhood. Much harder to do here in Bega with FOGO bins. But if you are living in North Sydney, that's an amazing position to be in, because you will have neighbours who live in apartments who can't compost their own waste, and you could become a compost host and compost their waste for them, which if you do start hot composting, you'll realise food waste is gold. You want as much of it as possible. So that could be a really great thing for you to do for your community as well.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Kate. A lot to cover in an hour, but it was
I know.
it was good
We
fun,
need to have,
and I think, you know,
we
just
might have
doing that and not getting all the questions, that we'll have a few spin-off webinars that maybe focus on each sort of topic.
Yes. Look,
because you can go into so much detail.
Each topic could be an hour, could be 2 hours, you know.
That's right. and thank you for everyone who stuck with us over the technical difficulties. So apologize for that. That's my fault. But
no, it's we will. Don't blame yourself.
Well, I will send out the videos in an email. We'll answer as many questions as we can that
would be great. Yeah, I'm very happy to answer your questions.
Yeah, and let us know in the evaluation what you're interested in, anything compost wise, and hopefully we can have Kate back again and cover
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks, Jordan. Thanks everyone for attending.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Have a great night. And
happy composting.
Thanks to Megan for sending the videos. Okay, thanks everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Jordan. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Good night.